The impressive history of the Chinese civilization predates the Romans and is roughly on par with the Mycenaean Greeks. The Shang dynasty began around 1600 BC, at which time the characters which would form the basis for the written Chinese language were already in use, examples of which survive today inscribed as oracles upon tortoiseshell and bone. Yet within that ancient stratum of the Chinese language have been found words of Indo-European origin. Mead in English and Russian med come from an Indo-European word medu, meaning honey. In modern Mandarin Chinese, honey is mi, from a much earlier Chinese form met, from which Japanese acquired the word mitsu, and Vietnamese mat. This word for honey that spread throughout East Asia is of very ancient European origin, but it isn't alone. How did it happen? Was it just through trade links, or were there really Europeans in Bronze Age China? Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and consider supporting the channel through Patreon, PayPal, Super Stickers, or you can now check out our products page, link below. I'd like to thank all my friends for their kind support. Although there are 56 constitutionally recognized ethnic groups in modern China, the Han are by far the majority, making up around 90% of the population, and nearly 16% of the global total population when including Han people throughout all Asia. An ethnic Han genetic study in 2020 suggested that their original heartland was to be found in the Shanxi region, with a southward diffusion over the Bronze and Iron Age, and a more recent northward expansion. Their language is archaically connected to Tibetan, which was likely brought southward during this diffusion, but the linguistic origins are still very obscure. However, the test revealed something else, something less expected. There is, even in the modern Chinese population of Shanxi, a detectable Western Eurasian or European genetic component of about 3 to 5%. This European genetic signature decreased further away from north of Shanxi, and is at undetectable levels further south in China. But here, near the heartland of the Han, there is an Indo-European genetic admixture. Alongside this are male haplogroups typically associated with Indo-Europeans, R1b, and a slightly less percentage of R1a. A pie chart of their diffusion by region shows a clear path from west to east, following the Silk Road right across the Yellow River and into the heart of China. The dating for this admixture is still unknown. Some of it may date to a later classical period of the Silk Road, but there is good reason to think that at least some of it has more ancient origins. The Afanasievo culture developed on the steppelands of western Russia and Ukraine around 3300 BC, and were very closely related to the Yamnaya culture, in fact, almost indistinguishable from them. Yet, while the Yamnaya began to expand west and south, the Afanasievo moved east, far east. Using cattle to pull wagons loaded with their young children and belongings, they set out to find where the sun rose. The men rode bareback with halters made of antler, herding their cattle ever onwards across the endless expanse. One afternoon, along the eastern horizon, mountains appeared like unmoving storm clouds rising from a sea of grass. Around 3200 BC, an entire people journeyed over 3,500 kilometers, or 2,100 miles over grassland facing toil and unknown dangers, to reach the foot of the Altai Mountains. There, they and their descendants dwelt for thousands of years. Afanasievo burial sites have been found from the Minosinsk Basin in Russia, on the Mongolian side of the Altai, and through the Dzungaria region of Xinjiang, China, a place sandwiched between the Altai and the Tian Shan Mountains. It's almost certainly from the Afanasievo culture that the later historically attested Tocharians emerged. They are known from Chinese historical records and archaeological remains, including beautiful and remarkably preserved paintings. But most significant of all is the preservation of their language in thousands of surviving manuscript fragments. Their languages were not Chinese, nor of the later Indo-Iranians, but had more similarities to Proto-Germanic and other Western European languages. They survived as a distinct people until around 1000 AD, living in and around the Tarim Basin, along what was by that time the very active Silk Road. They played a role in spreading Buddhism into China, and most of their language is preserved as translations of Buddhist texts. It had previously been thought that the Tarim Basin mummies belonged to them, but recent genetic testing shows that the mummies actually belong to an isolated ancient North Eurasian population of former hunter-gatherers. Now, to set the stage a little, since most of the unfolding details involve the modern Chinese province of Xinjiang, it would be helpful for people to get an idea of the scale. It's a big place. Big. Ireland could fit into it 19 times. It's 3 times bigger than France, more than twice as big as Ukraine, and slightly larger than Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado combined. Much of it is inhospitable, nearly impassable mountains, deserts with cold winters, yet full of unquestionable beauty, and with oasis-like micro-regions able to sustain crops and grasslands for pasturing herds. During the time that the Afanasievo and their descendants first settled in the region, it is thought to have been more fertile than it is today. It was inhabited by some people of ancient Northeast Eurasian descent in the south and west, as well as those related to Proto-Sino-Tibetan in the east, who formed the Majayao culture. It was here that the Indo-European peoples first interacted with the ancient ancestors of the Han. The Afanasievo brought copper technology with them, and it seems to have been from them that the technology of copper and then bronze first spread in East Asia. They disseminated their knowledge and techniques to the Majayao, whose approximate territory spread through Gansu to the upper Yellow River. To exchange such technology may have involved an alliance between people, and evidence suggests a prolonged relationship between the Majayao and the Afanasievo, as metalworking techniques developed and spread through North China, likely through a chain of alliances. The technology was so highly guarded and controlled that it didn't reach southern China for another 1,000 years. It was also with the Majayao that the earliest preserved examples of the solar symbol or swastika appear before the later spread of Buddhism, with which the symbol would later be most associated. It has been argued that the symbol is of Proto-Indo-European origin, and it seems that it was adopted by the Majayao from the Afanasievo, perhaps from examples woven into fabrics or painted on perishable mediums. In addition, the solar wheel motif also appears frequently in Majayao pottery, also a significant Indo-European symbol throughout the Bronze Age. They were also partly responsible for the rise of pastoralism in the region. New archaeological data presented by Dr. Chong Yu, The Origin of Cattle in China from the Neolithic to the Early Bronze Age, finds that the domesticated cow was introduced into China between 3000 and 2000 BC from the northern steppes. During this period, the only possible candidate for that introduction was the Afanasievo. The word cow in Chinese, "niu," is of Indo-European origin. The typical Japanese word is ushi, but an alternative word in reading of the kanji is gu or gyu, taken from the earlier Chinese pronunciation, which clearly resembles the Indo-European guo. The Chinese word for dog, go, also appears to be from Indo-European Kwon, hence the Japanese reading Ku or archaic Quen, and the Chinese combination reading Guan, and we can compare this to the later attested Tocharian Ku. These words, along with that of honey, were some of the earliest words borrowed into the Sino-Tibetan language, possibly directly from Proto-Indo-European, as the Afanasievo would still have been speaking Proto-Indo-European in a period long before the development of Tocharian, or any other possible unknown language branch. There is some debate about whether the Afanasievo likewise introduced the domestic horse to China. According to a paper on the subject published in 2016 by Yunzhou Yang of the Shanghai Academy of Agricultural Science, genetic testing demonstrates the domestic horse was introduced into China via the northern steppe, but the date for this is uncertain. Some of the earliest finds for what appear to be domesticated horses are in Shanxi. Their bones were found in a tomb dated to between 2500 and 2000 BC. If so, they must have ultimately been of Afanasievo origin. Some have argued that the Chinese word for horse, ma, is related to the English word mare, or the Celtic word marcos. The Manchu word for horse is morin, and Mongolian mor, which do seem tantalizingly similar. However, surviving Tocharian A texts use yuk, and Tocharian B Yakwe, both cognate with Gaelic ech, from Proto-Indo-European hekwos. Possibly, this similarity is coincidental, or as some have argued, it represents a specific word for a horse no longer preserved in our surviving Tocharian manuscripts. Probably as early as 3000 BC, the European-derived Afanasievo people were in direct contact and building alliances with Proto-Sino-Tibetan people, dwelling in the Gansu corridor and up to the upper Yellow River. This contact and possible network of alliances led to at least some genetic exchange through marriage bonds. Through these bonds, technology and innovation flowed, which would give a key advantage to the ancestors of the Huaxia in gaining dominance. By around 2000 BC, the Andronovo culture began to spread across the central steppe. They were at least partially derived from the corded ware culture in Eastern Europe, a large group of whom began migrating east. The Indo-Iranian languages were spread by them, along with the technology of the chariot. Previous theories suggested that they gained dominance over the entire Asian steppe, but recent studies suggest a far more complex situation. Genetic studies are now able to distinguish between Andronovo and Afanasievo ancestry, and it's confirmed that major cultural groupings on the Altai steppe at the time were primarily of mixed Afanasievo descent. So although the mummies are not the Tocharians, they are actually anciently related to them in a way, through the Chemerchek. Their stone stelae traditions and art style were something of a fusion of local Asian styles with Yamnaya-related traditions, and their art style, which would later be called Scythian, is now argued to have spread west from the Afanasievo-related groups around the Altai, later imitated and turned into the Scythian style. A 2022 genetic analysis of Bronze Age Xinjiang by Chao Ning et al. Has concluded that since the arrival of the Afanasievo, steppe-derived ancestry was appearing throughout Xinjiang, but that there was another influx of steppe pastoralists into western Xinjiang around 1500 BC. The study concludes that this represented the Indo-Iranian Andronovo expansion. It also concluded that the modern Tajik population is the closest living population to the Scythians of the region. However, the populations in the north continued to be primarily derived from Afanasievo origins, which had also mixed somewhat with the local populations in the east and south. A separate analysis of the inhabitants of the Zhongaria region showed that the Afanasievo lineages were dominant there and in the east of Xinjiang throughout the Iron Age. Thus, the Tocharians in the Tarim Basin were just the last holdouts after the historical expansion of the Han. However, the key Bronze Age technology made its way east with the Andronovo, the chariot. One Chinese word for the chariot is chi, which in the modern language can refer to any kind of motor vehicle. The character actually depicts a carriage, and is pictured from above, like those depicted in ancient rock art. A Japanese reading is ko, kyo, or kuruma. It is also used in a more archaic Chinese combination, gulu, meaning wheel, and revealing the older sound corresponding to the Japanese. This word is related to Tocharian kukal, from Proto-Indo-European kweklos, meaning wheel. Likely it doesn't come originally from Tocharian, but an earlier form of the language or even sister language. It could not, however, have come from Indo-Iranian, as the language had already gone through different sound changes, appearing as chakra, well before the time the chariot is introduced to China. There is much other gear related to chariots, wheels, and horse gear that are of Indo-European origin, either from the Tocharian branch or borrowed from Indo-Iranian. Around 1600 BC, the traditional start of the Shang dynasty, the northeastern steppe was changing. What had earlier been lush and prosperous was becoming drier and colder, putting increasing pressures on the people of the region. It was around this time that the Mongolian people, due to changes in climate that made agriculture difficult, began to adopt the pastoral lifestyle that would later define them. These changes were affecting the Proto-Tocharians as well. Expansion of Indo-Iranian tribes from the west may have also been putting pressure on their grazing lands. Reflected in the hymns of the Rig Veda, thought to be composed during the exact same period, Indo-Iranian tribes were flying across the plains in chariots, driving their enemies before them, taking the cattle granted to them by Indra from their defeated foes. Possibly this was a factor which drove some people that had previously dwelt upon the steppe into the Tarim Basin, and those in Zhongaria further eastward through Gansu and towards the Yellow River. Chinese historical accounts, though written after the Shang period, speak of frequent raids by barbarian horsemen from the west during this period. At least some of those were bound to be Proto-Tocharian tribes. Yet there is another side to the story told by the archaeological record. While undoubtedly there were raids and fighting with western tribes, there was also trade and even imitation. There were significant material connections between the Shang dynasty and the steppe. Chariot technology, as discussed, came to the Shang from the steppe, and the earliest Chinese chariots are close copies of steppe designs of their day. Many of the finely decorated weapons used by the Shang have exact parallels in the Karasuk culture of southern Siberia, such that they were either imported or were local imitations. Though sometimes claimed to have been Indo-Iranian, the Karasuk are likely to have been a mixed local development of the Afanasievo culture. Whatever their ethnic origins, it's likely that those dwelling in the Zhongaria region at the time, the Proto-Tocharian Sagse culture, derived from the earlier Temerchek, were ultimately responsible for introducing the chariot and other goods from the steppe to the Shang. By around 1100 BC, some Proto-Tocharians established the Subeshi culture at the eastern end of the Tarim Basin, near Turfan. Their material culture was similar to that of the steppe at the time, with Scythian-like artwork. The dry climate has allowed for the preservation of many amazing finds, such as the oldest preserved horse saddle, dated to between 727 and 396 BC, and what's believed to have been a priest or shaman who had in his possession 789 grams of cannabis, thought to have been used for medicinal or divination purposes. Around the 1st century BC, they would establish the Jushi kingdom, which would last 500 years before being conquered by the kingdom of the Beiliang, who were believed to be a people of heavily mixed ethnicity from the region of Gansu. The city was maintained, but was later destroyed by the Mongols. Its remains can still be visited today. The Iron Age Tarim Basin was a hive of cultures. The Tocharians were present on north, south, and east, while the Indo-Europeans were initially confined to the west. They were early converts to Buddhism by the Gandharvans. They translated major Buddhist texts, and based on artistic depictions from their finely decorated tombs, they helped spread the religion further east to the Han. Their cities were not small. The Book of Han records that the Tocharian city of Kucha had 81,000 inhabitants, and Agni had 32,000, which, given the time period and location, was significant. Sorting out all the ethnic changes, movements, and historical events that took place in the region during the Iron Age, however, requires multiple future videos. Be sure to ask for it in the comments if you'd like to learn more about the spread of Buddhism, or the amazing and dramatic events of Han period Xinjiang. While definitive proof is lacking, it is possible that during the later Bronze Age, there were physical migrations of people with Indo-European ancestry eastward through Gansu and across the Yellow River. We know of several such Iron Age groups from later Chinese historical accounts, but it's reasonable to think that earlier eastward moves by some Tocharian-related tribes had also taken place well before recorded history, either in the Shang or Zhou period, and possibly even earlier. One such later group is the Xinjiang culture. They dwelt in Gansu, were pastoralists who likewise practiced some agriculture, and they had a similar art as that of the steppes at the time. Possibly they were Tocharian in language. Their culture is dated to have started around 1000 BC and ended around 100 BC. There were also the Yuezhi, known from Chinese historical accounts, who likewise dwelt in Gansu, but went on to conquer Central Asia, creating the Kushan Empire. They became called Tocharians, and the same name was later applied by Turks to those who dwelt in Xinjiang and spoke the language that we now call Tocharian. Possibly, the Yuezhi were Tocharians, or this may have just been a historical confusion. The so-called Lesser Yuezhi were said to have migrated further east, crossing the Yellow River and settling in Shanxi, becoming part of the Jie people. There was also the Ordos culture, dated to a similar period. They were located across the Yellow River in what is today northern Shanxi. If these movements were happening during the period of recorded history, similar movements may have happened earlier, and may go some way to explain the strong steppe connections noted in the Shang and Zhou cultures. A movement of Afanasievo-derived peoples from Xinjiang into Shanxi may have brought chariots, weapon styles, and possibly some elements of religious belief and burial styles that are noticed in the Shang period. The dispersal of European-derived haplogroups may also be some evidence for this ancient eastward settlement. The Tocharians of the Tarim Basin were the last remnants of what had once been a much larger Indo-European population, dwelling in and around China for thousands of years. The Tocharian language is thought to have died out around 1000 AD, as the population was absorbed after the Turkish conquests of Xinjiang. The modern Uyghur population, descended from that medieval Turkic migration, has a good deal of Tocharian admixture, and are estimated to be the closest living population to the Tarim Tocharians. These ancient Bronze Age people contributed immensely to the development of East Asia through the spread of technologies, techniques, cattle, horses, and of course chariots, and to some small extent even had a genetic contribution. those ancient European peoples who crossed the steppes 5,000 years ago hold a small but interesting and important place in the epic history of China. Well, I hope you liked the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe. Consider supporting the channel on Patreon, PayPal, or through YouTube Super Stickers. Don't forget to check out the merchandise link below. And as always, stand tall.